This week we break from the narrative of Kings and look at the prophet Hosea and his message in chapters 1 through 3. Now, Hosea is kind of like the deathbed prophet of Israel. He's prophesying in the midst of the final reign of Hosea, and he's announcing exile, and he's announcing judgment, and he sees the people taken into exile. And he actually, in his story, we're pretty familiar with the story of Hosea and Gomer. He kind of becomes a living parable, as the prophets often did, of God's character, his righteousness and judgment, and specifically Hosea's relationship with his wife. Though at times does picture God's judgment, it primarily demonstrates God's faithfulness to his people in the midst of the horror of exile, and he presents a hope of regathering his people to himself as his beloved bride through the ministry of the Messianic King, whom we know to be Jesus Christ, the Son of David. So as we look through chapters 1 through 3, it's a little lengthy of a narrative, but not too lengthy. We're going to look at just through chapters 3, verse 5. We see some times where it actually feels a little harsh. Chapter 1, it seems that way at times, but it ends with a reflection upon the faithfulness of God, and it demonstrates God's faithfulness specifically to his promises given in the Abrahamic covenant, which came before the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic law, God had already redeemed his people from Egypt. He'd made promises to Abraham that he would bless him, and that through his lineage, all the families of the earth would be blessed. And he repeated that with Isaac, and he repeated that with Jacob. And we see God being faithful to his promises, but we see God also disciplining his children. They're going through a season of deep hardship. They've been going in deep sin. Now they're experiencing the curse of that sin in the exile, as outlined in Deuteronomy 28. And they're now experiencing the discipline of the Lord. But the result that would be produced as from this discipline would be one that would be glorious and peaceful. I mean, Hebrews 12 reminds us of this truth, that a father disciplines his son because he loves them, and he desires them to leave the way of sinfulness behind and embrace the peaceful fruit of righteousness. So when we think about the discipline of the Lord, really a lot of things in our life kind of come together, both good and bad, is part of the Lord's discipline in our lives. But particularly when we think of hardships, these are opportunities where the Lord is revealing aspects in our life that need to be repented of, that need to be put to death, so that we might put on Christ. So when we go through times of hardship, there are opportunities for us to receive the discipline of the Lord. And this is an opportunity just to pause as a group and discuss, like, why is it difficult for us to receive the Lord's discipline? And then talk about how faith plays into these roles of hardship. Play in these moments of hardship, and how faith keeps us focused not on the circumstance, but on what the Lord is seeking to do in our lives through the circumstance. And as we're talking through that, again, we can highlight this aspect in chapter 2. It's very important. It's a good reminder. It comes up all the time in 2 Kings. It's just that there's this great lie that Satan is telling to humanity, and that is that you can have a more fulfilled life through sin than you can with God. And it's a lie. It's deceived Adam and Eve. It deceived Judas, and it's deceived all of us at one point or another. But ultimately, the greatest fulfillment in life is found not through living in sin, but through pursuing Christ and his righteousness. And then spend most of your time talking about this last section, which is the hope that we have in the new covenant. That Israel's hope in the new covenant is the same as our hope in the new covenant. And that is that God will turn our shame into glory. He'll turn the valley of Achor into a door of hope. Now, if you don't know what the valley of Achor signifies, read this section right here. It goes back to the narrative in Joshua. But ultimately, sin brings shame into our lives, and we've all sinned. Thus, we all know the power of shame and the hold that it can have in our lives. But God, through Jesus Christ, removes the shame of our sin through the forgiveness and cleansing that is offered to us in the gospel. That is just so profound, that we have the righteousness of God in our lives, that we've been cleansed from our sin. We have no shame, no guilt, that we will live forever in that reality. And then the Lord will betroth his people to himself. This is, as the church, we are his bride. We might be tempted that God is wanting to keep us at an arm's length, or that he holds his nose with us. he does not begrudgingly love us. He views his people as a husband views his beloved bride, and he delights in us, and he sings over us. He loves us. This reality is really too glorious for us to comprehend. And then lastly, the Lord will bring his people unto himself in his kingdom. This is our hope. Our bodies will be resurrected, and we will live with Christ in his kingdom, in the fullness of his kingdom, which is the new heavens and the new earth. And we live in that reality spiritually, but that will be physically realized in the future. We will live in God's land, and we shall know the joy of his presence and new creation as glorified individuals, unhindered by sin. So talk about this good news and highlight just one is just a shepherd, just really just comfort your people with this news, but then highlight how this hope and discuss how does this help us order our lives? How does this help us live with eternal perspective? How does this help us filter out our experiences and live in light of them? And just point people again to the fact that the blessings of the new covenant are only made possible through the redemption that is accomplished by Jesus Christ, the Son of David. There is no other hope except through Jesus Christ. Call your people unto salvation, and call your people to walk with him in their salvation and to live a life of faith in the Son of God who loved us and gave himself for us.